Our presentation tonight is on data recovery by Andrew von Raymond Mapp. Did your hard drive ever fail and you hadn't backed it up? Yikes! And you had really important data on that hard drive? Well, tonight, Andrew's going to tell us how he can solve that problem for you. As president of DATAANALYZERS, Andrew von Raymond Mapp leads complex and time-sensitive corporate cyber investigations, including data breaches, employee data theft, and data recovery for mission-critical data loss. Andrew has over 15 years of IT security experience and has developed expertise in mission-critical data recovery, offensive and defensive cybersecurity, electronic discovery matters, and in digital forensic investigations. Andrew is president of the FBI's Orlando InfraGard. 6 very impressive certifications are behind his name. He's been quoted in Forbes magazine and has provided his expertise in several television appearances, as well as testifying as an expert witness in both the Senate and federal courts. So listen up. It's only a matter of time before you will experience a hard drive failure. Let's give a big STUG welcome to Andrew von Raymond Mapp. Andrew.
Good evening, and thank you, Anne, so much for the warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in front of the group. I hope everyone is able to hear me clearly. If not, please let me know if I need to adjust my microphone or anything.
You're good.
Fine, I'm assuming. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I must say, I'm kind of envious as almost everyone has a really cool background, except me. So very, very cool. I may have to get some tips and some recommendations there, how I can improve for my next presentation, because I've really seen some awesome backdrops there. Assuming that most of them are green screens. But yeah, I'll take some recommendations there. As Anne already mentioned, I run a company called DATAANALYZERS, which is a data recovery company. We're based in Orlando, Florida. We've been doing this since 2009. And while we are in Orlando, we pretty much service the entire country. Plus, we have clients in Canada and the Caribbean. I did include a little video here. I'm not sure if everyone is able to hear that. Can we hear that?
No.
Is that a yes or no?
No.
Oh, did you share your sound when you shared your screen?
All right. Any idea how I can share the audio?
Yeah, go to view options, I think at the top, and there should be share audio, computer audio. If not, if you go out, if you unshare, and then when you share back in, there's a box on the lower left that says share computer audio.
Share sound. Thank you so much, Huey, and let me know if it works now.
To get his data quickly from the hard drive, but became very frustrated. A friend told him about DataANALYZERS.com. DataANALYZERS.com turned out to be the right choice. Why? They do things other data recovery companies can't or won't do, like proprietary custom tools that allow them to alter hard drive firmware, advanced research and development, perform factory-specific drive functions for Seagate, Maxtor, Western Digital, and a whole bunch of other drives I can't even pronounce. And that's that's a good thing too. DataAnalyzers.com can perform the job expertly, cheaper and faster. They were able to retrieve all of Bob's data. Not only that, they have file listing, a class 100 clean room. If they can't recover it, there's no charge. Member of the Better Business Bureau, and they're secure and confidential. Plus, Data Analyzers provides the best value in the industry. How do they do it? They are recognized as the exclusive U.S. representative of the Global Data Recovery Alliance, which is the world's first and only professional association of independent commercial data recovery experts. The Global Data Recovery Alliance shares research and development. This allows data analyzers to leverage the experience of non-competing data recovery experts from all across the globe. That's why they can stay on the bleeding edge of data recovery techniques and pass that savings on to you. Hey, why don't you move on over there and get yourself a free analysis? That's dataanalyzers.com.
All right, so that was kind of the 2-minute in a nutshell version. We'll go into some more details. I had a slide about myself, but Anne already did such an awesome job of introducing me that I'll just gonna hit and skip that. Basically, what I want to cover here today is how not to lose your data. So what we can do to prevent data loss. And then I also want to speak about the type of data loss that we can experience if it does happen, and then go into some details as to some of the type of recoveries that we do on a frequent basis, and then also have a Q&A session where we can answer any questions related to data storage and data recovery. So what we recover data from, for the most part, anything. I usually tell clients, if you can store data on it, we usually can recover it. So some of the things that we've recovered from are quite proprietary or uncommon devices, but your obvious ones are the recoveries from PCs, Macs, external hard drives, USB thumb drives, flash drives, obviously smartphones, your iPhones, your Samsung Galaxy, LGs, various Androids, Blackberries, servers, if it's personal NAS storage appliances, small business servers, and enterprise data storage. We also recover data from archive tape backups, literally from oldest generations to the newest tape backup formats. For example, 2 years ago, we've got a request to restore data from some backup tapes for an airplane manufacturer that had tapes of another airplane manufacturer that they acquired many years ago, and this was data that dated back to the 80s, but it was such legacy format that there really weren't a whole lot of people around that still had the ability to extract the data, and in that case, it was blueprints for the airplanes that they created back in the 70s and the 80s. Obviously, we do CDs, DVDs, floppy disks. Pretty much, you can store it. You can store data on it. We recover it. We've done voice recorders. Obviously, we've done CCTV and video footage and various proprietary devices. Some of the clients that we have that you may recall or are familiar with include the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, University of Central Florida, Hard Rock Cafe, IBM, Darden restaurants and the National Guard. The list of clients extends far beyond that. Some of them we have non-disclosure agreements with, where we can't really release that we've done any work, because if you think, for example, there really aren't any banks that really want to admit that they've lost critical databases with client data on, because the IT department made some mistakes and miscommunicated and crashed some mission critical data. But we work with everyone from individuals to small businesses to large corporations. We do a lot of this work in what's called an ISO class 100 certified clean room. Basically what that means is that there's less than 100 dust particles per square cubic foot. And while you may think, well, why is that important? If you have a hard drive and you were to open the sealed chamber to expose the platters of a hard drive, dust particles would quickly start settling onto the surface. So even though we don't see it, there's dust particles here everywhere in the air. And the air that we have, even if it's in a relatively sterile environment, for example, in a hospital, there's still so many dust particles in the air that if you were to open a hard drive, these dust particles would start to settle onto the platter surfaces and would quickly start degrading the platters and damage them, preventing a recovery and or at least severely complicating the process. So a class 100 clean room has what's called HEPA filters, which will extract or filter out essentially the air and filter out dust particles to purify the air. So that's essentially the process in a nutshell, so that when a hard drive is opened, you won't have these dust particles flying all around and settling in on these disks and these platters. What I wanted to cover here briefly is, let's jump into data loss. So I usually say one of the biggest or the biggest problem with data loss is that no one really thinks it's going to happen to them. I've spoken to so many individuals at all levels that did not think data loss was going to happen. And I'll tell you, it can happen to anyone. It happened to me personally, which is one of the reasons I got into the data recovery industry, is because I suffered from some data loss, and I was surprised that at the time there were very little options in getting the data recovered. So one of the biggest problems really is having the perception that, well, it's going to happen to Bob or it's going to happen to Sally, but no, it's not going to happen to me because I know what I'm doing. And that is really one of the biggest, if not the biggest, caveat when it comes to data loss. And I can tell you, we have consumers, we have retired people that lose data, we have people in college that lose data, we've had physicians, we've had politicians, we've had IT people, both independent as well as corporate IT departments. We've had large institutions that lost data. So it's really not something where we can assume that we're safe from data loss. So the best approach really is to assume that data loss can happen to anyone, including yourself. And having that mindset, now we can take a look at, well, if this could happen to me, what can we actually do to prevent data loss? And the most obvious aspect, obviously, is backing up your data. And while it may sound simple, it's not always as straightforward. So I'll give you a few examples. One of them is on a consumer level. You may have a hard drive that you're backing up to an external drive somewhere. But for example, what happens if, and this has happened, where coincidentally, both your main storage fails and shortly thereafter, your backup, be it an external hard drive, thumb drive, or anything in that capacity also fails. Oftentimes for a totally different reason. That could be the first reason: your main computer crashes and fails because the hard drive just had a lot of wear and tear and just failed, and it was actually time to replace it. Well, you have a backup, but now your son or grandson was running around and accidentally knocked off the cable. It tripped the drive to fall off of the computer desk. Now your primary as well as your secondary, your backup is damaged, and you're in a predicament of now having to go down the route of potentially an expensive and complicated recovery process. And really the best approach there is to have a tiered system where you have multiple backups, where you're not relying on one single backup. The other thing to mention and consider here is, as we're in Florida, having a local backup is better than not having a backup at all. But if we do suffer from flooding, if we do suffer from a hurricane, and your backup is in the same room or same office or same house as your main system, and they're both exposed to water, for example, then that backup has not matched its purpose. The same thing applies if there is a fire. We do deal with fire damage more frequently than you probably would expect it. So having a backup is great. But now the second step is really to emphasize, what is this backup strategy going to look like? Having an external drive to back up your data is kind of a first tier and is good to have. Now the second question then becomes, well, what do we do about having this local exposure? One of the options there is having a secondary drive and storing it somewhere else, which could be, for example, in a safe, a safety deposit box, a different residence, a different facility. Obviously, the other option that we have these days is cloud storage. So that is a very good option. I usually recommend not to rely 100% on cloud storage per se, but having a multi-tiered approach where you have a local backup and you have a cloud backup. So that's generally a pretty good approach. And then it really comes down to your backup schemas. How frequently do you need to back up your data? And that's really not something anyone can tell you what the best approach is for your particular situation, because it really depends on how much data do you have and how frequently is it changed and updated. If you don't update your storage frequently, if your files are predominantly archived and they don't change much, you can do infrequent backups. If you have a lot of data, documents, pictures, proposals, and things that change on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, then you should probably have a daily or weekly backup routine. And again, same there for a local backup and ideally a cloud backup so that you're protected. The other aspect to consider is if you want to encrypt the backup or not. Generally, the best approach would be to encrypt the data, both in the cloud as well as local. Local to avoid any exposure anyone potentially tampering with the data, especially if it's something that's dear to you or sensitive. And in the cloud, to really protect your data from any predators and any cyber attacks that may expose your data inadvertently, right? So having encryption both locally and in the cloud would be my ideal recommendation there. Now, from a business perspective, backups are implemented more frequently, but you would also be surprised, especially with small businesses, how oftentimes they either don't have a backup or there is a backup because Sam configured it back in 2015, but the problem is it stopped working in 2017 and no one ever checked on it. And so it hasn't been backing up for the last 3 years. And there's a very similar thing that happens in larger corporate environments where there's more sophisticated backup technology and mechanisms in place where, yes, the backups are being completed and they're being monitored, but oftentimes what happens is they're not properly being tested in a disaster recovery scenario where a real world disaster is essentially emulated and a restore is performed to properly ensure that how the backup restore should work in theory is really the way it's going to work practically. And that's, for example, where a lot of large corporations end up in big trouble because they're not testing these disaster recovery and restore scenarios out very frequently. So yeah, for a large corporation, disaster recovery planning and restoration would be the recommendation. For a small business, ensuring that there are backups and that the backups are being monitored. Not relying on that someone set those backups up a long time ago and there's the assumption that they're still working and are backing up properly. And then for the consumer, just to reiterate again, it's ideally having 2 backup sources, one of them local, one of them in the cloud, and ideally encrypting both instances of the data. Now to switch back gears into the data recovery mode, if you do end up in a situation where you lose data, a recovery in most cases is still possible. So there still is light at the end of the tunnel. Typically, hard drives are the most common storage devices that fail. And you can see here on my screen to the left, we have a hard drive with the platters exposed. One of the main reasons why hard drives fail more frequently than other common storage devices is that we have mechanical components and that there is wear and tear that happens on these devices. So eventually there's going to be wear and tear, and even for the greatest hard drive, it's going to degrade and it's going to fail. So we usually say it's not a matter if your hard drive will fail, but just a matter of when it will fail. And to give a few situations here of what can happen when a hard drive fails, you can have the least of the undesirable situations, which is usually if there's bad sectors that have built up over time on the hard drives and the hard drive just isn't able to read certain areas of the platter surface, which can result in slow performance of the hard drive. It can result in you're trying to open up a file and it will just crash the hard drive, or in more severe situations, it can result in the hard drive not being recognized at all by the computer or by the BIOS, or intermittently being recognized. Now, this is an issue that's relatively simple to deal with professional equipment, where we're able to image the hard drive from the bad drive onto a good drive, and use specialized data recovery equipment to do the process where we're essentially communicating not with the BIOS, but directly with the controller chip on the hard drive's circuit board. The second type of failure that happens is failure to the printed circuit board, the PCB, which essentially is the electronics of a hard drive. There we can have various things that can happen. On the simpler side, there are TVS diodes that function in essence like a protector, almost like a fuse. These can fail and can yield to a situation where the hard drive will just no longer power on at all. Then you have the motor controller, which essentially is the brain of the hard drive that can malfunction. You also have the motor controller, which can malfunction, which is responsible for spinning the actual hard drive and causing this high degree of rotation. They can overheat, for example. That's a relatively common situation. Sometimes you can identify that by the actual motor controller chip actually there being a heat bubble, or you can actually see a burn mark on that controller chip. These hard drives spin at very high cycles. For typical IDE and SATA drives, it's usually either at 5,400 revolutions per minute or at 7,200. For SAS and SCSI drives, they easily exceed 10,000 RPMs, 12,000 RPMs, depending obviously on the model. And then the third failure type on a hard drive is when there's a mechanical failure. And that is usually the least desirable one, the most complicated to recover from, and often also the most costly. And the reason for that is because your read and write heads are supposed to hover over the platter surface without actually touching the platter surface. So while a lot of people, I don't know when this happened, but it's generally been assumed based on some things that people said that your data is on hard drives is stored on ones and zeros, but it's actually not true. Your hard drive actually stores data not in a digital form, but it's actually an analog signal. It's actually magnetic impulses. And so it's an analog signal, and your heads, similar to a vinyl player, will move across the platter surface and through magnetic impulses will start reading those analog signals. And then later that signal is converted into a digital signal by a read channel. But what happens on mechanical damage in most situations is these heads that are supposed to hover above the platter surface start making contact with the platter. And at that point, they start scraping data off of the actual surface. And that's what starts causing the notorious clicking sound, and in worst case scenarios, an actual scraping sound. So if you do hear those, you immediately want to shut down the hard drive to prevent any additional damage and seek a professional data recovery lab that can assist with that. The only way of getting data recovered in that situation is to open it inside of a clean room, replace the read and write head, the arm that you see on there, and read out the good aspects or the good parts of the data. Now, the success rate on that varies quite heavily depending on how much damage has occurred, what type of a drive it is, what type of model. There's various other aspects that can come into play. But typically, even if there is a mechanical failure, there still is a high chance of a successful recovery. Now, to the right, we have a solid state drive, our newer technology. Fails less than our hard drive, and no longer has the dilemma of these mechanical aspects where there's parts rotating and wear and tear to mechanical components. So there's no more platter damage, no more clicking, none of that. So that's the good news. Generally speaking, SSDs also tend to fail less than hard drives. There is, however, also a downside, and that is that SSDs do fail. And as there are more and more SSDs now in the market and they're becoming more and more affordable, the failure rate actually is increasing. And then the other problem is that while hard drives are, if we're looking at storage, is a cheap storage commodity these days, where we can buy an enormous amount of storage relatively quickly. And that's been one of the issues that solid state drives had struggled to catch up with. And over the last few years, they've made some significant improvements in reducing cost and at the same time increasing storage capacity. However, now we're seeing more and more consumer grade solid state drives where there is an additional downgrade in quality of components, which directly, we can see a direct translation or a direct correspondence to lower quality components and higher failure rates. So SSDs are great, however, don't have the assumption that they cannot fail or don't fail. They do fail as well. And on a solid state drive, a recovery in most cases ends up being more costly than a recovery on a hard drive. And in some instances, currently, based on the technology that's available as of February 2021, there are a significant amount of solid state drives that if a certain type of failure happens, a recovery currently is not possible. And a lot of it has to do with data actually being encrypted on the actual data chips, the actual NAND chips, or it has to do with there being a very sophisticated dynamic XOR pattern of how the data is stored that makes it very complicated to recover. And there are some limitations with current data recovery techniques and technology that's available to recover certain SSDs. With that being said, there's about 50–60% of SSDs where successful recoveries can be performed without any issues. And then for the other 40–50%, it really depends on the type of failure that occurred. Again, SSDs also have a printed circuit board, and now we have pure electronics, so they do also suffer from failure to the electronics. Those are issues that usually can be overcome. So as technology advances, things may change in the future, but I just wanted to make you aware that solid state drives, as good as they are, they do fail as well. And on some of them, a recovery is actually not possible at the current time. Okay, so I mentioned earlier the printed circuit board, the PCB. This is a typical printed circuit board on a hard drive. And we can see in the middle what is labeled the LSI. That is actually the MCU, the main controller chip of the hard drive, sort of the brain of the device. And to the left of it, we actually see a ROM chip. And to the right, we see a square chip labeled smooth. That is actually the motor controller that I mentioned earlier that can burn out, and you can actually see heat bubbles or burn marks if that happens in many cases. Now, this is where the hard drive, the PCB, will actually connect and communicate directly with the read and write heads in the hard drive's chamber, the HDA, hard disk assembly is what we usually refer to that. And it takes that signal, brings it out to our printed circuit board, to our controller, which then converts that signal into a digital signal that then is exited from the circuit board through your SATA cable, or if it's an older drive, through an IDE cable, and is then sent to your computer, where the BIOS is then able to detect it and is able to deal with the digital signal that it at that point has received. Right, so we can see here on the hard drive the different components. We have the printed circuit board that we just mentioned. We can see a platter here. That's what they typically look like. There's only 2 form factors for platters. Well, there's an exception on some SCSI drives, but typically there's only 2 form factors, to 2.5 inch for a laptop drive, or as it's also used in a lot of external enclosures, such as a Western Digital My Passport, for example. And then we have the 3.5 inch diameter, which are for the desktop or full-size drives. And in addition, we can see here we have the read and write heads to the right. That's the actual arm that's responsible for reading the actual data. All right, here we can actually see what platter damage looks like. This is a case where the heads have actually made contact with the hard drive and have started to scrape away the data. And we can see here we have this ring in the middle. That's what I'm referring to. That is what platter damage looks like, and a recovery from that. Best case scenario will turn into a partial recovery, and worst case scenario into indefinite data loss. So this is the worst case scenario that you essentially want to avoid. And that's why if you do hear any type of clicking, beeping sounds, scratching sounds, anything from a hard drive, it's very important to immediately shut down that hard drive. All too frequently, we encounter situations where a hard drive failed and someone decided to try all kinds of different things to see if they can recover it, or they've taken it to a computer repair shop and they've tried all kinds of tools on it. The problem with that is if there is mechanical failure to the drive, which is easily recognized by the noise, there is no software that's going to be able to salvage the data from that. And the longer a drive is powered on, the more damage it's actually going to cause. And so therefore, avoiding that is really the only recommendation I can give here. Now, this is a case of platter damage. This is a more severe case of platter damage. We can see to the right where there is a platter, and we can see specks all across the platter. Now, this is not specks from dust particles in the air, but this is actually the platter surface that's been scraped away. So you have your lubricant and your actual data. It's literally been scraped away. So recovery from this is impossible. To the left, we can see what used to be a white filter. All drives have one of these filters inside, and they're typically white. Here we can see that the filter has a lot of staining from a gray substance. We usually refer to this as platter dust. And this is your data. I can almost see a Word document and a PowerPoint in that filter somewhere. So this is the absolute worst case scenario. There's no recovering data from this type of failure. And that's usually what happens when the drive keeps running and spinning while it failed mechanically. Now, this is something you may not see all too often. This is a high resolution picture of a read and write head, which is the small component attached to the arm that's actually responsible for reading the signal from the platters. These are extremely small and extremely delicate little creatures. And that's what's actually reading the analog signal and sending it back to the hard drive. Now, I don't recall the magnification on this particular picture, but it's probably 20 or 40. Now, this is what a solid state drive actually looks like. For those of you who haven't seen the inside of a solid state drive, this is what the guts actually look like. We again have a controller chip similar to a hard drive, which would be the black rectangular or, well, more squared chip to the left. And we can see in this case, this one is a Samsung chip. That's the controller chip. And then right under that, we also have another chip that has the Samsung branding on it. This is actually the RAM chip for temporary storage. The other chips that we see here, the other 8 chips are what are called NAND chips. That's where your actual data is stored. And depending on the size of the SSDs, you could have more or less. Typically, the other side of this SSD is also populated with these NAND chips. So here we have 8, and in this particular case, there also would be 8 on the other side. In many cases, if a recovery has to be performed and it's not a simple matter, all of these chips will have to be unsoldered with typically a infrared soldering station or a reflow station. And then the data has to be read out from these chips, from each chip separately. And then the entire thing has to be reassembled again. So it ends up being a gigantic puzzle that has to be pieced back together to be able to turn it back into usable data. All right, I think that's what I wanted to cover. Just to go back really briefly, we see these NAND chips that we have on the solid state drive. Essentially, it is the same technology that you have in a USB flash drive. I have one here somewhere. Right, when we have one of these little USB flash drives, it's essentially the same technology as we have in the SSD, just I would say of a lesser quality. So we have a controller chip in there, similar as we would have in the SSD, like the Samsung that we were looking at. And then we also have a storage chip, which is a NAND chip, similar to the 8 chips that we see on the SSD. So same technology, and for the most part, a similar process in terms of recovering those, unless it's a simple type of failure with the electronics on a flash drive, thumb drives. The actual data chip has to be unsoldered and removed, and then the data will be read out manually from them. And the same applies to compact flash cards and SD cards, same technology. All right, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. So we're opening up for any questions that we have, and I can answer for you.
Well, go ahead and unshare your screen so we can see everybody. Very interesting. I'll start a question. In the case of ransomware, the big companies and corporations and governments where somebody has encrypted the data on their hard drive. Question one is, can you undo that? Or two, why is it that they have to pay the money if they're doing backups?
Right, good question. So can they be unencrypted? Typically not. Typically not. There are a few exceptions. And the exceptions are sometimes the actual servers that host the ransomware get actually compromised and taken down by good guys, and the decryption keys are made available. And if that is the case, they can be used to decrypt the data. The other scenario where recovery is possible is where the data was actually previously deleted, or there was a previously deleted instance of the data before it was encrypted, and then the deleted version of the data can still be recovered and salvaged. So those are typically the two scenarios that you have. If a recovery is not possible because there isn't a previously deleted version that could be salvaged or recovered, and there currently isn't the decryption keys currently are not known or have not been shared or made available, then you only have two options. One is pay the ransom, and the option number two is to patiently wait and hope that at one point these servers will be compromised and taken down, and then the keys are made available. And usually, while they're not always the first to do so, some of the antivirus vendors will actually release freely some software products that can help you to then decrypt the data. As for the second part of the question, why these, was it hospitals?
There's all kinds of big corporations, hospitals,
Right.
Government agencies.
Why these corporations end up paying the ransom goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the disaster recovery planning, where their backup solution is not as well thought out as they thought it would be. So oftentimes with these cybercrime gangs that spread the ransomware, what they will do is they will hack into the corporate networks. They will decrypt the data, and then they will look for backups, and they will delete and destroy the backups, preventing a successful restoration of it. Now, if you're using tape backups and you're storing them offsite somewhere, then for the most part, you are relatively safe. However, there has been a more recent trend with these cybercrime gangs of what they've started doing now is, in addition to decrypting the data, they're now also threatening to release the data to these corporations' clients and or to sell off the data on the black market. Now, if you're in that situation, well, and you have reliable offsite backups, you've resolved part of the equation that you're able to restore the data, but now you're still facing the dilemma of the exposure of your client records or trade secrets, confidential information, things of that nature.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Bob G has his hand up.
A little bit of advice for those of us at home never ever leave the external device in which you create your image backup attached to your system while it is online. You create your image backup while you're offline, and before you go back online, disconnect that external hard drive. That way, if CryptoLocker hits, it may encrypt your hard drive, but it's not going to get to your backup drive.
Yes, absolutely agree with that.
Tim, you have a question. Unmute yourself.
My question is for home users who lose their data. Do you have the ability to restore older versions of data, like older operating systems, older Windows, older Mac operating systems data? Because they have to buy a new machine, and the new machines can't recognize the older data in many cases. Thank you.
Tim, can you give me a scenario or an example?
Oh, yes. A lot of people keep using their older machines because it's doing the job for them, and they've got, say, their genealogical records in an older version of the genealogy software that's no longer sold or updated on an older operating system. And when the machine dies and they replace it with a brand new machine, it won't run that old genealogy software, and all your data is gone. Years of collecting photos and, copies is gone.
So are you asking if we can make a bootable image of the original drive again?
I'm asking what options would clients have? Is this something they could come to you with and you could somehow transform it or make it usable for them again? I know there's a wide variety of problems that could occur with old software not being available anymore. So I know it's not a single pat answer, but I just wondered if this was the type of thing your company could tackle.
So the one thing that we can do in that type of scenario, but it's not always possible. For example, if it turns out that there's mechanical issues and the drive is in a really bad condition, then that may not be possible. But in many instances, we can take the damaged drive and we can make a image copy and make that bootable again so that you can use it in the old computer again. So, if that was running Windows 98, Windows Millennia, or even XP, you'll be able to boot up the old computer and keep utilizing it. If you're asking if we offer any support in converting or migrating legacy data to something newer so that it would be compatible, let's say your genealogy software from Windows Millennia to Windows 10, no, that's not something that we do. You just don't have the really time to allocate to those specialized projects, and it probably wouldn't be financially feasible.
Understand? Yeah, that's where user groups can come in, because I know groups like Washington Apple Pie, they have 10, 15 old computers going back to 1984.
Wow. That
can boot up and read your recovered data. So,
okay, next.
That's a niche.
Thank you, Tim.
When your husband dies and he had all of the family photographs on the computer, you want to recover those.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
If it's anything that's not proprietary, you know, like just pictures, then certainly you'll be able to we can transfer those to an external drive so that you can use that on any system. I wasn't sure if I
Nope, that's clear.
Totally.
Thank you.
understood the question and answered it.
You did. You did.
Okay.
Dave Gerber, question.
Actually, a comment. I don't know who it was who asked the previous question, and I'm not familiar with the software that he's referring to, but is it possible to export your data in a different file format that may be, for example, in Excel spreadsheet format, that you might be able to open it up in a more current program, so at least you don't lose the data?
Was it a question for me or for the other gentleman?
No. For the person who asked the question about what do I do if I can't, run this program anymore,
Right.
and I lose all my data.
I understand your answer, Dave. Thank you. Yes, you'd have to go to a user group or a source that had the older hardware that could use the recovered data, that a professional like Dave could recover the data. And then you'd go to sources that could actually read that data and do what you say, convert it to JPEG, or convert it to PDF files from ClarisWorks, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if we can get some questions dealing with the topic. Sharon?
Yes. Are external hard drives like a Western Digital solid state?
So while Western Digital does make solid state drives, and they do have a few external versions, typically the ones that you see are not solid state drives. They're typically the regular rotating hard drives with the mechanical components. So if you look at Amazon for Western Digital external drive, you will see, there may be an exception, but typically you will see the mechanical drives. And same if you go to a Best Buy or Walmart to pick up an external drive, they will all be mechanical. So you will specifically have to specify solid state or SSD external drive if you're searching for it.
So is it better to get a solid state external?
In my opinion, it is, because if it falls over, it's not going to fail. It could still fail, but not due to shock, which is the most common cause why external hard drives are failing.
Final question from Sally.
Yes, can you recommend some solid state drives or backup drives by brand?
That's a good question. Solid state drives, I usually like Samsung. So I usually recommend the Samsung Evo series. They're, in my opinion, pretty reliable. If you want to go for traditional hard drives, I usually would recommend going with Western Digital over some of the other brands out there.
A final question from the chat box was, where did you go to get your excellent knowledge? College, or did you learn it on your own?
Well, I went to college, but not for this. I studied industrial engineering, so it's pretty much been all self-taught.
Interesting. All right, on that note, Ann, we'll turn it back to you. I'm going to remove the spotlight here so we can, if people want to go back to the view, they can change the view. And Ann, we'll, for the final roundup, turn it back to you.
Andrew, thank you. Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation tonight. Wow, I didn't know there was so much you could do, and I'm glad to know it because I'm the one that always gets in trouble. I did want to ask you one question, and that was about you are the president of the FBI Orlando InfraGard. Can you tell me what that is?
Sure. So the FBI has, well, actually, quite a long time ago, the FBI started a public and private partnership because they realized that information sharing was key to both protecting our nation in terms of cybersecurity and in terms of terror threats. But they've realized that most people, as well as most companies, didn't really feel too comfortable hobnobbing with the federal agents. And they weren't really making a whole lot of progress showing up at corporations and asking for them to share information. And so they developed this concept, which became InfraGard, and eventually became a nonprofit organization that is designed to share information bi-directionally with the FBI and with the corporate or the private sector. And now we have a InfraGard chapter in almost every major city in the country. And so that's a way for the FBI to communicate and be in touch and stay in touch with the local community in terms of business leaders, technology leaders, and also a bi-directional flow of information where members of the InfraGard receive privileged and at times confidential, but information that doesn't require any clearance. And that information can then be used to take them back to the particular group or organization or company that you're working for, where you can now inform everyone, hey, the FBI just told us there are some bad guys in North Korea that are currently running some attacks, and they're using these email addresses right here. So let's make sure that we're blocking these so that we don't become victim of that.
Gosh,
And
that's marvelous.
In the other aspect, corporation, for example, or as we do a lot of data breach investigations, we may notice a pattern. It's like, oh, we're noticing this strange pattern that's been happening over the last 4 or 5 days from Eastern Europe. And then we can share that information with the FBI and or with other members of the InfraGard group. And so there's a chapter here in Orlando where I'm currently the president of. We have a chapter, active chapter in Tampa. There is a chapter in Jacksonville, and there is one in Miami, and I believe there's one in Tallahassee.
4 of them in the state.
Yes.
4 chapters in the state. That's fantastic. Wow. That's an awful lot of information that you all know a lot about. That is great. Well, we want to thank you so much. What a fabulous speaker you were. And even I do not understand that much about computers, was able to follow along with everything you said tonight. So thank you so much for making such an informative presentation. We truly appreciate it. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you, Ann.
To Andrew. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really great.
It's my pleasure, Ann. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. And now, before we leave tonight, I do believe there is going to be a $50 gift certificate that goes out to some lucky person that stayed through. And if Diane Guptill is here, Diane, there you are. Oh, you're not there. Is that Diane?
No.
No, Hannah, it's you. Diane Guptill, are you still here?
Yes.
All right, there you are. You are the lucky winner tonight for a $50 gift certificate. And you will be in touch, or Sharon Rump will be in touch with you. So be sure that you get a hold of Sharon, and Sharon, be sure you get a hold of Diane, and we'll make sure you get that gift. Okay, thank you, every one of you. I think there was something like 66 people that came tonight.
Yeah,
Wow.
68 showed at one time,
68 came at one time. That is fantastic. We're just delighted to see all of you. We look forward to seeing you again in the very near future. And who knows, maybe, who knows when we'll be able to see each other in person again. But this is a lot of fun. And we enjoy, I think these Zoom meetings are really great. So until next time, I want to say thank you all for coming, and we will see you again very shortly. Good night.
Thanks,
Adam.
everybody.
Thank you.